On the evening of October 3, 1961, Michael Brennan sat at his desk in Weld Hall Dormitory at Harvard University, reviewing calculus equations while classical music drifted from the radio perched on the windowsill. Outside, autumn leaves swirled across Harvard Yard in the crisp Massachusetts air, and students hurried between Gothic buildings with their collars turned up against the cold. Michael believed his biggest challenge that semester would be maintaining his grade point average while managing his part-time job at the university library. He thought his roommate, a quiet physics major named Peter Davison, was simply an exceptionally dedicated student who kept irregular hours due to late-night study sessions at the Science Center. Michael had no reason to suspect otherwise. They had been randomly assigned as roommates at the beginning of the academic year, and their arrangement seemed ordinary in every way. But over the next 8 months, Michael would discover that nothing about Peter Davison was ordinary at all, and that the young man sleeping 6 feet away was living a carefully constructed lie that connected directly to Soviet intelligence operations targeting American nuclear research. The truth would shatter Michael's understanding of trust, friendship, and the invisible war being fought in dormitory rooms across America. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Michael Thomas Brennan had arrived at Harvard in September 1961 with the typical mixture of excitement and terror that afflicted most freshmen. He was the first person in his family to attend college, let alone an Ivy League institution. His father drove a delivery truck for a bakery in South Boston, and his mother cleaned houses in Beacon Hill. They had sacrificed enormously to supplement Michael's scholarship, believing that education was the ladder their son would climb out of their working-class neighborhood. Michael felt the weight of their expectations every day, pushing himself to excel in his mathematics courses while working 20 hours a week shelving books and helping students navigate the labyrinthine stacks of Widener Library. At 18 years old, he was painfully aware of the gulf between himself and his classmates, many of whom came from families where Harvard attendance was a tradition stretching back generations. Michael compensated for his insecurity by working harder than everyone around him, studying until 2 or 3 in the morning, taking detailed notes in every lecture, and approaching each assignment as though his entire future depended on it. In many ways, it did. Peter Davison had introduced himself on move-in day with a firm handshake and a friendly smile that seemed genuine enough. He was 20 years old, 2 years older than Michael, and explained that he had spent 2 years working before coming to Harvard to study physics. Peter said he had grown up in Minneapolis, where his father managed a hardware store, and that he had worked construction to save money for college. He stood about 6 feet tall with sandy brown hair, blue eyes, and the build of someone who had indeed spent time doing physical labor. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance, nothing that would make him stand out in a crowd. He dressed in the standard uniform of Harvard students in 1961, khaki pants, button-down Oxford shirts, V-neck sweaters, and worn leather shoes. His accent carried the flat vowels of the upper Midwest, and he spoke with the measured cadence of someone who thought carefully before expressing opinions. In those first weeks of the semester, Peter seemed like exactly what he claimed to be, a hard-working, older student who took his studies seriously and appreciated the opportunity Harvard represented. The dormitory room they shared in Weld Hall measured roughly 15 feet by 20 feet, with 2 narrow beds, 2 desks, 2 small wardrobes, and a single window overlooking Harvard Yard. A radiator hissed and clanked throughout the night, providing inconsistent heat against the Boston autumn. Michael had claimed the desk near the window, while Peter took the one near the door. They established a comfortable routine quickly. Michael typically studied at his desk until midnight or later, while Peter often left after dinner to work at the Science Center library, returning around 11 or later. On weekends, Michael sometimes went home to South Boston to have dinner with his parents, while Peter usually stayed on campus, citing the need to catch up on reading or complete lab work. They were cordial roommates rather than close friends, respecting each other's space and schedules without developing deep intimacy. This suited both of them fine. Michael was too focused on his studies to prioritize socializing, and Peter seemed similarly dedicated to his academic work. The first odd detail Michael noticed came in late October, about 6 weeks into the semester. He had returned to the room unexpectedly one Thursday afternoon because his economics lecture had been cancelled. Peter was supposed to be in a physics lab until 5 o'clock, but when Michael unlocked the door and entered, he found Peter standing by his desk with a startled expression, quickly sliding something into his desk drawer. The movement was smooth but unmistakably furtive. Peter recovered quickly, explaining that he had felt ill and left lab early, but something about his manner struck Michael as false. The smile did not quite reach his eyes, and there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested discomfort rather than illness. Michael did not press the issue, simply nodded sympathetically and sat down at his own desk to begin reading for his philosophy course. But the moment lingered in his mind, a small discordant note in what had been an otherwise unremarkable arrangement. Over the following weeks, Michael began noticing other small irregularities, though none seemed significant enough to warrant concern on their own. Peter received very little mail, which was unusual for a student whose family supposedly lived in Minneapolis. Michael, despite his family living just across the Charles River, received letters from his mother at least twice a week, along with occasional packages containing homemade cookies or warm socks. Peter's mailbox remained empty day after day. When Michael mentioned this casually one evening, asking if Peter's parents were not the letter-writing type, Peter had responded that his mother had arthritis that made writing difficult, and his father preferred phone calls. This seemed reasonable enough. But then Michael realized he had never once heard Peter speaking to anyone on the payphone in the hallway, and long-distance calls were expensive enough that most students made them sparingly, and often attracted attention from other residents waiting to use the phone. Peter's family situation appeared to be one marked by unusual silence. Another odd pattern emerged around Peter's study habits. While he claimed to spend most evenings at the Science Center library, Michael occasionally saw him elsewhere on campus. One Tuesday evening in early November, Michael was walking back from Widener Library around 9 o'clock when he spotted Peter standing on Massachusetts Avenue, apparently waiting for something. Peter was not carrying any books or papers, and he appeared to be watching the street rather than heading anywhere in particular. Michael called out a greeting, but Peter either did not hear him over the traffic noise or chose not to respond. When Michael asked about it the next day, Peter claimed he must have been waiting for a bus and apologized for not noticing Michael. But there was no bus stop at that particular location, a fact Michael knew well from his own countless walks across campus. The explanation made no sense, yet Michael did not challenge it. There was something in Peter's demeanor that discouraged further questions, a subtle closing off that Michael respected out of habit rather than understanding. The academic semester progressed through November and into December, with the rhythm of classes, exams, and papers consuming most of Michael's attention. Peter continued his pattern of evening absences and late returns, often arriving back at the dormitory after midnight. Michael, who stayed up late studying, would sometimes still be awake when Peter came in, noting that his roommate occasionally seemed preoccupied or tense. Peter explained these late nights as necessary for completing physics problem sets or working on lab reports, and Michael had no reason to doubt this. Physics at Harvard was notoriously demanding, and many students in technical fields kept irregular hours. What Michael did find strange was that Peter never seemed to study in the room itself. Most students, no matter how much they worked in libraries, eventually brought materials back to their dormitories. Michael's own desk overflowed with books, papers, notes, and journals. Peter's desk remained almost eerily neat, with just a few textbooks, some blank notepaper, and basic supplies. There was a Spartan quality to Peter's possessions that extended beyond simple tidiness into something more deliberate, as though he wanted to maintain the ability to pack everything quickly if necessary. The semester ended with final exams in mid-December, and students dispersed for winter break. Michael returned to South Boston, grateful for 3 weeks of his mother's cooking and the chance to earn extra money working seasonal retail. Peter mentioned he would be staying in Cambridge over the break, explaining that he had a research opportunity with one of his physics professors. This struck Michael as impressive, since research positions usually went to upperclassmen. but Peter had proven himself to be an excellent student with consistently high grades. Michael thought little more about it, too absorbed in his own family obligations and the pleasant routine of sleeping late and watching television with his younger sister. Harvard seemed distant during those weeks, almost dreamlike, and Michael found himself questioning whether he truly belonged in such a rarefied environment. His father reassured him that hard work would prevail, and his mother reminded him that the Brennan family had never been quitters. Michael returned to Cambridge in early January 1962 with renewed determination to excel in the spring semester. When Michael arrived back at Weld Hall on January 2nd, he found Peter already in the room, unpacking his belongings from a small suitcase. They exchanged pleasantries about their respective breaks, though Michael noticed Peter offered only vague generalities about his research work and quickly changed the subject to ask about Michael's family. This was characteristic of Peter's conversational style. He rarely volunteered specific information about himself, but showed polite interest in others, deflecting attention away from his own activities. Michael had initially interpreted this as modesty or reserve, but he was beginning to recognize it as a more deliberate strategy. Peter seemed to have perfected the art of being present without being known, of participating in conversations without revealing anything substantial. This realization made Michael uncomfortable, though he could not articulate why. There was nothing overtly threatening about Peter's behavior, yet something felt carefully controlled in a way that suggested intention rather than personality. The spring semester brought new classes and renewed academic pressures. Michael was taking intermediate calculus, American history, English literature, and introductory economics. Peter's schedule consisted of advanced physics courses, differential equations, and a chemistry class. They continued their established pattern of coexistence, crossing paths in the morning before classes and occasionally in the evening before Peter departed for his usual late-night study sessions. But Michael had begun paying closer attention to details he had previously overlooked. He noticed, for instance, that Peter's textbooks looked pristine as though they had rarely been opened. Most students' textbooks quickly accumulated the wear of constant use. Broken spines, highlighted passages, marginal notes, coffee stains, and dog-eared pages. Peter's books looked almost new, despite being several weeks into the semester. This seemed inconsistent with someone who claimed to spend hours each night studying. One Saturday afternoon in late January, Michael was in the room alone, working on a history paper about the American Revolution. Peter had left early that morning, mentioning he needed to meet with his physics study group. Michael had been typing on his portable typewriter for about an hour when he accidentally knocked his pencil off the desk. It rolled across the floor and came to rest beneath Peter's desk. Michael got down on his hands and knees to retrieve it and, in the process, noticed something odd about Peter's desk drawer. The drawer appeared to be locked, which itself was not necessarily unusual, but there were scratches around the lock mechanism that suggested frequent use. More curiously, the drawer seemed deeper than it should be based on the desk's construction. Michael had an identical desk, and when he compared them, he realized Peter's drawer bottom sat at least 2 inches higher than his own. This suggested a false bottom or hidden compartment, though Michael could not imagine why a college student would need such a thing. He told himself he was being paranoid, letting Cold War hysteria and spy novels corrupt his perception of ordinary reality. Yet the observation lodged in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. The first week of February brought heavy snowfall to Cambridge, transforming Harvard Yard into a winter wonderland that photographers loved and students cursed as they trudged through slush to 8 o'clock lectures. On the evening of February 8th, Michael was studying in the dormitory common room because the heating in his room had failed. Around 9:30, he decided to return to the room to retrieve a different textbook. As he walked down the hallway toward his door, he heard voices inside. This was unusual, because Peter rarely had visitors, and Michael had not invited anyone over. Michael paused outside the door, not intending to eavesdrop but uncertain whether to interrupt. Through the door he could hear Peter speaking in a low, urgent tone. The other voice was male, older, speaking with an accent Michael could not immediately identify. Eastern European, perhaps, though not strongly pronounced. The conversation was too muted for Michael to make out specific words, but the tone suggested serious business rather than casual student chat. Michael stood in the hallway for perhaps 30 seconds, debating what to do, when suddenly the door opened. A man in his 40s wearing a dark overcoat and fedora emerged and walked past Michael without making eye contact. The man moved with purpose down the hallway and disappeared down the stairwell. Michael entered the room to find Peter standing by the window, looking tense. Peter explained that the man was a friend of his father's who happened to be in Boston on business and stopped by to say hello. This explanation seemed thin, particularly given the hour and the obvious discomfort in Peter's demeanor. But Michael accepted it with a non-committal nod and retrieved his textbook, returning to the common room without further comment. But the incident added another piece to a puzzle Michael had not consciously realized he was assembling. As February progressed, Michael found himself increasingly preoccupied with Peter's behavior. He recognized this attention was probably unhealthy, a distraction from his own studies. Yet he could not shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. He began making mental notes of Peter's comings and goings, noticing that his roommate's schedule was far less consistent than he had initially believed. Some nights Peter would be gone from 7 until past midnight. Other nights he would leave at 9 and return within an hour. There seemed to be no pattern tied to academic obligations. Michael checked the physics department calendar posted in the science center and confirmed that there were no regular evening labs or review sessions that would explain Peter's absences. When Michael casually asked other physics majors if they knew Peter Davison, most had never heard of him, despite the physics program being relatively small and intimate. This was odd, since Peter was supposedly an excellent student who worked closely with professors and participated in study groups. Someone should have known him, yet he seemed to move through the department like a ghost, present but unnoticed. In early March, an incident occurred that transformed Michael's vague suspicions into serious concern. He had developed a bad cold that kept him in bed for 2 days, missing classes and spending most of his time sleeping or reading. Peter had been solicitous, bringing him soup from the dining hall and checking whether Michael needed anything. On the evening of March 7th, Michael had fallen asleep around 6 o'clock, exhausted from congestion and low-grade fever. He woke suddenly around 9, disoriented and thirsty. The room was dark except for the lamp on Peter's desk. Peter was sitting at his desk, hunched over something, completely absorbed. Michael remained still, watching through half-closed eyes from his bed. Peter appeared to be writing, but not in the manner of someone composing an essay or solving problems. His movements were methodical and precise, consulting what looked like a small book, writing something down, then consulting the book again. After several minutes, Peter carefully put whatever he had been writing into an envelope, sealed it, and placed both the envelope and the small book into his desk drawer, which he locked with a key from his pocket. The entire sequence had the quality of ritual, something done many times before. Peter then rose, put on his coat, and left the room quietly, clearly believing Michael was still asleep. Michael lay in bed for several minutes after Peter's departure, his mind racing despite his illness. There had been something undeniably secretive about what he had just witnessed, something that went beyond normal student privacy. The following morning, Michael's fever had broken, and he felt well enough to attend his afternoon classes. Peter was at a morning lecture, so Michael had the room to himself. For the first time in his life, Michael seriously considered searching through someone else's belongings. Everything in his upbringing, every value his parents had instilled, screamed against such a violation of trust. Yet the accumulated oddities had reached a critical mass that demanded investigation. Michael spent 10 minutes wrestling with his conscience before walking to Peter's desk and trying the locked drawer. It did not budge. He had no tools for picking locks, no experience with such things. He felt simultaneously relieved and frustrated. His ethical training had won out over curiosity, yet the questions remained unanswered. Michael returned to his own desk and tried to focus on studying, but his attention kept drifting back to that locked drawer and what it might contain. That evening at dinner in the dining hall, Michael sat with several other students from his calculus class. The conversation drifted to current events, particularly the escalating tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union following the Cuban Missile Crisis of the previous October. Someone mentioned reading an article about Soviet intelligence operations in America, about how the Federal Bureau of Investigation estimated there were hundreds of Soviet agents operating in the country, many using false identities and seemingly legitimate covers. Another student scoffed at this, calling it Cold War paranoia and government fear-mongering. But the conversation made Michael acutely uncomfortable, and he found himself unable to eat the rest of his meal. He kept thinking about Peter, the locked drawer, the mysterious visitor, the odd pattern of absences, the pristine textbooks, the absence of any real connection to family or friends, the careful way he deflected personal questions. Each detail alone could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern that Michael could no longer ignore. He left the dining hall early and walked aimlessly through Harvard Yard, trying to convince himself he was being ridiculous. But he kept coming back to one inescapable question. What if Peter Davison was not who he claimed to be? Michael spent the next 3 days in a state of anxious indecision. He considered confronting Peter directly, but could not imagine how such a conversation would go. What would he say? "I think you're lying about your entire identity because your textbooks look too clean and you lock your desk drawer." He considered telling someone in authority, but immediately realized how absurd his suspicions would sound without concrete evidence. He was a working-class kid from South Boston who was still adjusting to Harvard's elite culture. Making wild accusations against a fellow student would likely destroy his own reputation and mark him as unstable or paranoid. He considered simply requesting a room change, but that would solve nothing, and might even put him at risk if his suspicions had any validity. Michael felt trapped in a situation where any action seemed worse than inaction, yet inaction felt like betrayal of some duty he could not quite name. The stress was affecting his sleep and his studies, and he found himself checking over his shoulder constantly, wondering if Peter had noticed his increased wariness. On the evening of March 11th, the situation came to a head in an unexpected way. Michael had been working in Widener Library until closing time at midnight, then walked back across the deserted yard toward Weld Hall. The campus was quiet except for the wind in bare tree branches and the distant sound of traffic on Massachusetts Avenue. As Michael approached his dormitory, he noticed someone standing in the shadows near the building entrance, apparently waiting. Michael slowed his pace, alert now, recognizing something purposeful in the figure's stance. As Michael got closer, the person stepped forward into the light cast by a street lamp. It was a man in his 50s, wearing a long coat and rimless glasses, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The man spoke quietly, but clearly. "Are you Michael Brennan?" Michael, startled and instantly wary, confirmed his identity and asked who was asking. The man reached into his coat pocket, and Michael tensed. But what emerged was a leather wallet containing a Federal Bureau of Investigation identification card. The man introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Riley and asked if they could speak privately. Michael's mind reeled. How did the FBI know his name? What could they possibly want with him? Agent Riley must have seen the confusion and alarm on Michael's face, because he quickly added that Michael was not in any trouble, but that the Bureau believed he might be able to assist with a matter of national security. Michael, too shocked to do anything else, agreed to talk. They walked to a coffee shop on Massachusetts Avenue that stayed open late, catering to students, finding a booth in the back corner where they would not be overheard. Agent Riley ordered coffee for both of them and waited until the waitress had departed before speaking. He began by apologizing for the dramatic approach, but explained that discretion was essential. He then asked Michael a simple question. "Have you noticed anything unusual about your roommate, Peter Davison?" The question hit Michael like a physical blow. His suspicions, which he had been trying to dismiss as paranoid fantasy, were apparently shared by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Michael took a long drink of his coffee, buying time to organize his thoughts, then slowly began describing the accumulated oddities: the locked drawer, the mysterious visitor, the inconsistent schedule, the absence of mail or family contact, the pristine textbooks, the midnight writing session he had witnessed. Agent Riley listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. When Michael finished, the agent sat back and studied him for a long moment before speaking. "What I'm about to tell you is classified information," Riley said. "By sharing it with you, I'm placing considerable trust in your discretion and your patriotism. Michael nodded, his mouth suddenly dry despite the coffee. "The man you know as Peter Davison is not who he claims to be," Riley continued. "His real name is Viktor Petrov. He is a Soviet intelligence officer who entered the United States 18 months ago using false documentation. He enrolled at Harvard to gather information about American students who might be recruited as future intelligence assets and to monitor certain professors involved in classified research. We have been aware of his presence for approximately 2 months, and we have been building a case against him and his associates. Your observations have been very helpful in confirming aspects of our investigation." Michael felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. He had been living 6 feet away from a Soviet spy for 5 months, sharing a bathroom, exchanging pleasantries, breathing the same air. The entire reality he had constructed around his Harvard experience suddenly seemed fragile and false. Agent Riley continued explaining that the FBI had identified Viktor Petrov through a combination of surveillance and information provided by a Soviet defector. They had been watching him carefully, monitoring his contacts, trying to identify the full extent of his network before making arrests. The investigation had reached a critical phase, and the Bureau needed Michael's help. Specifically, they needed access to whatever Peter, or rather Victor, kept in his locked desk drawer. The small book Michael had seen was almost certainly a one-time pad used for encoding messages to Soviet handlers, and obtaining it would provide crucial evidence for prosecution. Agent Riley asked if Michael would be willing to help the FBI, emphasizing that there would be some risk, but that the Bureau would take every precaution to ensure his safety. Michael, still reeling from these revelations, asked what specifically they wanted him to do. Riley explained that they needed Michael to open the locked drawer, photograph its contents using a camera they would provide, and then lock it again without Victor knowing it had been accessed. This would need to happen when Victor was certain to be absent for at least an hour. The Bureau had locksmiths who could provide Michael with tools and brief instruction on how to pick the simple desk lock. Michael would have perhaps 30 minutes to photograph everything, then return the drawer to its original state. The operation would be supported by FBI surveillance teams outside the building, and Michael would have emergency contact numbers if anything went wrong. Michael sat in that coffee shop booth until nearly 2 in the morning, wrestling with a decision that seemed too large for an 18-year-old mathematics major from South Boston. Agent Riley had been patient, answering Michael's questions, addressing his fears, acknowledging the gravity of what was being asked. The agent had also appealed to Michael's sense of duty, reminding him that Soviet intelligence operations posed a genuine threat to American national security, and that ordinary citizens sometimes had to make extraordinary contributions. Finally, Michael had agreed, though the word yes seemed inadequate for the commitment he was making. Agent Riley had shaken his hand firmly, told him he was doing the right thing, and arranged to meet the following evening to provide equipment and instructions. Michael had walked back to Weld Hall in a daze, climbing the stairs to his room where Viktor Petrov, masquerading as Peter Davison, slept peacefully, completely unaware that his cover had been compromised. Michael had lain awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, wondering what he had gotten himself into. The next evening, Michael met Agent Riley in a parked car 3 blocks from campus. The agent handed him a small leather case containing a specialized miniature camera, extra film, and a set of lockpicks with surprisingly simple instructions. The picks were designed for basic desk locks, not sophisticated security systems, and Riley demonstrated the technique on a practice lock. Michael had never imagined himself learning such skills, yet he found the mechanism surprisingly straightforward. Pressure on the tension wrench, gentle manipulation of the pins with the pick, feeling for the moment when each pin set into place. After 20 minutes of practice, Michael could open the sample lock in under a minute. Riley emphasized that the critical thing was to photograph everything exactly as it appeared, then return everything to its precise original position. Victor had certainly memorized the arrangement of his drawer contents, and any change would alert him that his security had been breached. Riley gave Michael a number to call if anything went wrong, and reminded him to destroy the note with the number after memorizing it. They agreed that the operation would take place 2 nights hence, on March 14th, when Victor had a standing commitment that typically kept him away from the dormitory from 7 until after 10. The FBI would have agents stationed around the building to watch for Victor's unexpected return, but Michael would be on his own inside the room. The conversation ended with another handshake and Riley's reminder that Michael was serving his country in a meaningful way. Michael returned to his dormitory carrying equipment that could probably get him expelled or worse if discovered, wondering at what point his ordinary college experience had transformed into something from a spy thriller. The night of March 14th arrived with agonizing slowness. Michael had barely slept the previous 2 nights, running through scenarios in his mind, imagining everything that could go wrong. He attended classes on autopilot, unable to focus on lectures or readings. Peter or Victor maintained his normal demeanor, giving no sign that he suspected anything unusual. On the evening in question, Victor left the room at 6:45, mentioning he would be at the library until late. Michael waited 30 minutes to be certain, then retrieved the lockpicks from their hiding place behind his bookshelf. His hands were shaking so badly that his first 3 attempts to pick the lock failed, the picks slipping uselessly against the pins. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to recall Agent Riley's instructions about patience and steady pressure. On the 4th attempt, he felt the pins begin to set, one by one, until finally the lock yielded with a quiet click that seemed explosively loud in the silent room. Michael pulled the drawer open and found himself staring at contents that looked simultaneously mundane and ominous. There were notebooks filled with writing in what appeared to be Russian, several identification documents with different names and photographs, a small address book, a thick stack of typewritten papers, and the small book Michael had seen Victor consulting, which indeed appeared to be some kind of cipher key or one-time pad. Michael set up the camera on his desk, arranged the overhead light for optimal exposure, and began methodically photographing each item. The camera's shutter made a faint clicking sound with each shot, and Michael flinched every time, certain that someone in the hallway would hear and investigate. He photographed the notebooks page by page, the identification documents, every entry in the address book, and the typewritten papers which appeared to be reports about various individuals, some of whom Michael recognized as Harvard students or faculty members. The entire process took 42 minutes, though it felt like hours. Michael's shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air coming through the slightly open window. When he had photographed everything, he carefully returned each item to its exact position in the drawer, checking and rechecking that nothing was out of place. He locked the drawer again, returned the lockpicks to their hiding place, concealed the camera and film in his backpack, and then sat at his desk, trying to calm his racing heart and appear normal. At 8:53, Victor returned to the room earlier than expected. Michael, who had been genuinely trying to study to maintain appearances, looked up with what he hoped was casual interest and asked if Victor had finished his work early. Victor explained that the library's heating system had failed and they had closed the building for the evening. He moved around the room with his usual economy of motion, hanging up his coat, removing his shoes, sitting at his desk to glance through some papers. Michael watched covertly, terrified that Victor would notice something amiss with the drawer. But after a few minutes, Victor simply pushed his chair back and suggested they go get something to eat at the dormitory cafeteria. Michael, despite having no appetite whatsoever, agreed, reasoning that refusing would seem more suspicious than accepting. They walked together across the dark campus, making small talk about upcoming exams, and Michael marveled at his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while his entire nervous system screamed with tension. At the cafeteria, Michael forced himself to eat a sandwich and drink coffee, listening to Victor discuss physics concepts with an ease that suggested genuine expertise. This person was a remarkably good actor, Michael realized, capable of inhabiting a false identity so completely that nothing slipped through the mask. It was a chilling recognition. Michael met Agent Riley later that night to deliver the camera and film. The agent seemed pleased, assuring Michael that he had done excellent work that would prove invaluable to the investigation. Riley explained that the FBI would process the photographs overnight and analyze the contents. He cautioned Michael to continue acting normally around Victor, to give no sign whatsoever that anything had changed. The next phase of the operation would involve monitoring Victor's activities more closely to identify his full network of contacts before making arrests. Michael asked how long this might take, and Riley admitted it could be several weeks or even months, depending on what the photographs revealed and how the investigation developed. Michael felt his stomach sink at the prospect of continuing to share a room with someone he now knew was a Soviet intelligence officer, of maintaining casual conversation while knowing that Victor's entire existence was a calculated deception. But he had committed to helping, and he could not back out now. Riley sensed Michael's distress and reminded him that FBI agents would be watching the dormitory constantly, that Michael was safer than he realized, and that his contribution was genuinely important. They arranged regular check-in procedures using payphones and coded language, and Riley gave Michael additional emergency contact information. As Michael walked back to his dormitory that night, he felt as though he had crossed some invisible threshold into a darker, more complex world than the one he had inhabited just days earlier. His innocence about the nature of the Cold War had been stripped away, replaced by an understanding that the conflict between East and West was not abstract geopolitics, but a tangible struggle that reached into dormitory rooms and demanded sacrifices from ordinary people. The following weeks were among the most difficult of Michael's life. He continued attending classes, working at the library, maintaining his academic performance, all while living in close proximity to someone he now viewed with a mixture of fear, fascination, and something resembling pity. Victor continued his usual routines, apparently unaware that his cover had been compromised. He remained polite, considerate, and seemingly genuine in his interactions with Michael. There were moments when Michael almost forgot the truth, when they would discuss coursework or campus events, and Victor would demonstrate humor or kindness that felt authentically human. These moments were disorienting, reminding Michael that even spies were people with thoughts and feelings, individuals shaped by their own histories and loyalties. Victor was not a monster, but a man who had chosen or perhaps been compelled to serve his country in this particular way. Michael found himself wondering about Victor's real life in the Soviet Union. Did he have family, a wife, children? What had his path been to this room at Harvard? Had he wanted this assignment or had it been forced upon him? These questions would never be answered. Yet they haunted Michael as he tried to sleep 6 feet away from someone whose entire existence was built on lies. Agent Riley contacted Michael twice in the following weeks with updates. The photographs had proven extraordinarily valuable, revealing Victor's network of contacts and confirming that he was part of a larger Soviet intelligence operation targeting multiple universities and research facilities along the East Coast. The one-time pad had been analyzed by cryptographers, and the Bureau was now able to decode intercepted messages that had previously been impenetrable. The notebooks contained detailed assessments of American students and professors, identifying individuals who might be vulnerable to recruitment because of financial problems, political sympathies, or personal vulnerabilities. Some of the typewritten reports described classified research projects in ways that suggested Victor had either penetrated secure facilities or was receiving information from other sources. The case was expanding beyond Victor himself to encompass what the FBI believed was a significant espionage network. Riley emphasized that arrests would be made soon, but that timing was critical. The Bureau wanted to roll up the entire network simultaneously to prevent anyone from escaping or destroying evidence. Michael's role was essentially over, except for continuing to act normally and remaining alert for any sign that Victor had become suspicious. Riley thanked Michael repeatedly for his courage and service, but Michael felt little satisfaction. He was exhausted from the constant stress of deception and eager for the entire situation to reach resolution. The end came suddenly on the morning of April 7th, 1962. Michael woke to urgent knocking on the dormitory room door at 6:15. Victor was still asleep in his bed, and Michael, disoriented and alarmed, pulled on pants and opened the door to find Agent Riley and 4 other men in suits and dark overcoats standing in the hallway. Riley's face was grim and determined. Behind him, Michael could see several uniformed police officers at the end of the corridor. Riley spoke formally and loudly enough for Victor to hear. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for the arrest of Victor Petrov for espionage and related charges." Michael stepped back as the agents moved into the room. Victor was awake now, sitting up in bed, his face completely blank. For just a moment, His eyes met Michael's, and in that instant, Michael saw recognition and understanding. Victor knew immediately that Michael had betrayed him, that his cover had been compromised through some action of his roommate. But there was no anger in Victor's expression, just a kind of weary resignation, as though he had always known this moment would eventually come. He did not resist as agents helped him dress and then placed handcuffs on his wrists. He did not speak, except to acknowledge that he understood his rights when they were read to him. The whole process took less than 10 minutes, and then Victor was being led down the hallway, surrounded by agents, disappearing from Michael's life as abruptly as he had entered it 5 months earlier. The aftermath was chaotic. FBI agents searched the room thoroughly, photographing everything, seizing Victor's possessions as evidence. News reporters began arriving on campus within hours, as word spread that a Soviet spy had been arrested at Harvard. Michael was removed from his dormitory room and placed in protective custody at a hotel off campus while the FBI debriefed him extensively. Over 3 days, he recounted every detail of his interactions with Victor, every odd moment, every conversation he could remember. FBI officials praised his observational skills and his willingness to assist the investigation. They assured him that his identity would be protected, that his role in the case would not become public, and that he had rendered an important service to his country. But Michael felt strangely hollow. He kept thinking about that moment when Victor's eyes had met his, the recognition and betrayal that had passed between them. He had done the right thing, he believed that, yet it did not feel like a clean victory. It felt complicated and sad in ways he struggled to articulate. He wondered if Victor was being interrogated somewhere, if he would ever see trial or simply be exchanged in one of the spy swaps that occasionally made the news. He wondered what would happen to the people Victor had been reporting on, whether any of them had actually been recruited as Soviet assets or had simply been evaluated and rejected. The entire situation felt surreal, disconnected from the normal concerns of an 18-year-old college student. Michael was eventually allowed to return to Harvard, though he was assigned a single room in a different dormitory for the remainder of the semester. The university administration knew the broad outlines of what had happened, but agreed with the FBI that details should be kept confidential. A cover story was developed about Victor having dropped out due to family circumstances, and most students who even noticed his absence accepted this explanation without question. Michael tried to return to his normal routine, but something had fundamentally changed. He found it difficult to trust people, constantly questioning whether casual acquaintances were who they claimed to be. He became more withdrawn, focused even more intensely on his studies as a refuge from complicated emotions. His parents noticed the change when he visited home, but accepted his explanation that the academic pressure was taking a toll. Only his mother, with her intuitive understanding, seemed to sense that something more significant had happened. Though she did not press him for details he was not permitted to share. Michael finished the semester with excellent grades and returned to South Boston for the summer, taking a job at a construction site where physical labor helped quiet the persistent questions in his mind. The trial of Viktor Petrov and several associates took place in federal court in November 1962, attracting significant media attention as one of the largest Soviet espionage cases prosecuted in several years. Michael was called to testify, his identity protected through closed courtroom sessions where only the judge, attorneys, and defendants were present. He recounted his observations and his cooperation with the FBI investigation. Victor, sitting at the defense table, listened impassively throughout Michael's testimony, never making eye contact. When Michael had finished and was being dismissed, Victor spoke for the first and only time in Michael's presence. He said simply, "You were observant. In another life, you would have made a good intelligence officer." The comment was delivered without malice or sarcasm, almost as a compliment. Michael did not respond, leaving the courtroom confused by his own emotional reaction. Victor and 3 associates were convicted of espionage and related charges. Victor was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, but was ultimately exchanged to the Soviet Union as part of a prisoner swap in 1964, just 2 years after his conviction. Michael followed the news coverage of the exchange with mixed feelings, relieved the situation had finally reached a definitive conclusion, but unsettled by the knowledge that Victor had essentially escaped real consequences for his actions. Michael continued his studies at Harvard, graduating with honors in mathematics in 1965. He had maintained his academic excellence despite the psychological weight of his experiences. During his remaining years at the university, he occasionally cooperated with FBI requests for information about other foreign students whose backgrounds seemed questionable, though none of these subsequent matters proved as significant as the Viktor Petrov case. Michael had been changed by his experience in ways both subtle and profound. He remained suspicious of simple narratives, aware that people contained depths and deceptions that were not immediately apparent. He understood that the Cold War was not merely a conflict between abstract ideologies, but a human struggle that demanded difficult choices from individuals who had never sought involvement in espionage or national security. These lessons would shape the rest of his life, influencing his career decisions and his approach to relationships. After Harvard, Michael attended graduate school at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, earning a doctorate in applied mathematics. He eventually joined a defense contractor working on classified projects related to cryptography and communication security. The irony was not lost on him that his introduction to the world of intelligence operations as an undergraduate had ultimately directed his entire career path. He married a woman named Catherine, whom he met at a conference in 1969, and they had 2 children. He never told his wife or children the full story of what had happened with Viktor Petrov, maintaining the secrecy the FBI had requested, though he occasionally shared general observations about trust and deception that puzzled his family with their intensity. In 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing and the Cold War was ending, Michael received an unexpected letter forwarded through his former FBI contact, Agent Riley, who had since retired. The letter was from Viktor Petrov, writing from Moscow. In careful English, Viktor explained that he had lived in the Soviet Union since his exchange in 1964, working in various administrative positions, but never again serving abroad as an intelligence officer. His career had been damaged by his arrest, and he had lived under a shadow of suspicion that he had betrayed Soviet intelligence to American handlers. He had not, but the mere fact of his capture had been enough to destroy his standing within the intelligence apparatus. Viktor wrote that he was reaching out as an old man, preparing to settle his accounts with the past. He wanted Michael to know that he bore no ill will, that he understood Michael had acted according to his own loyalties and sense of duty, just as Viktor had done. He acknowledged that they had been pawns in a larger game that had ultimately benefited neither of them much. He said he had often thought about their brief time as roommates, remembering Michael as a serious young man with integrity, and he wanted to express a strange form of respect for Michael's observational abilities and moral courage. The letter ended with a simple observation. In the end, we were both young men trying to serve our countries as best we understood. History has judged which country had the better system, but that does not make our individual actions less sincere. Viktor signed the letter with his real name. Michael read the letter multiple times, experiencing a rush of emotions he had not felt in decades. He drafted a response but ultimately never sent it, uncertain what he could possibly say to someone whose life he had helped to derail, even in service of legitimate national security. He kept the letter in a locked drawer of his desk, occasionally rereading it over the years, finding in its measured words a kind of resolution to an episode that had haunted him since 1962. Michael Brennan retired from his defense contracting career in 2005, having contributed to numerous classified projects that remained opaque even to his family. He spent his retirement years gardening, reading history, and occasionally giving talks to high school students about the importance of mathematics education. He never mentioned his Cold War experiences in these talks, maintaining the discretion that had been requested of him more than 4 decades earlier. When his children occasionally asked why he seemed so interested in spy novels and Cold War history, he would smile and say simply that it had been an interesting period. In 2013, the FBI declassified portions of the Viktor Petrov case file as part of a broader initiative to make Cold War intelligence operations more accessible to historians. Michael's identity was still protected, referred to only as an unnamed Harvard student who had assisted the investigation. But enough details were released that Michael recognized his own story in the documents. He read through the declassified materials with fascination, seeing his observations and testimony from a historical perspective, understanding for the first time the full scope of the espionage network Victor had been part of and the genuine threat it had posed. Reading these documents gave Michael a sense of validation he had not realized he needed, confirmation that his actions had indeed mattered in the larger context of Cold War intelligence operations. He felt a measure of peace he had not experienced in decades, a closing of a circle that had begun on that October evening in 1961, when he had first noticed something odd about his roommate's behavior. Michael Brennan passed away in 2018 at the age of 75, surrounded by family and having lived a life of quiet accomplishment. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his role in exposing a Soviet spy ring at Harvard, focusing instead on his career in applied mathematics and his contributions to his community. His children, going through his personal effects after his death, found Viktor Petrov's letter in his desk drawer and were confused by its contents and the strange relationship it implied. They researched the name and discovered the espionage case from 1962, gradually piecing together their father's role in the matter. They felt simultaneously proud of his courage and sad that he had carried this burden alone for so many decades. They wished he had felt able to share the story with them, to let them understand this dimension of his character. But they recognized that his silence had been a form of integrity, a keeping of promises made long ago. The letter was donated to the Harvard University archives, along with some of Michael's other papers, where it remains available to researchers studying Cold War espionage, a small artifact of a conflict that shaped a generation but is increasingly fading into history. The story of how Michael Brennan discovered that his Harvard roommate was a Soviet spy is ultimately a story about the intersection of ordinary life and extraordinary circumstance. Michael had simply wanted to study mathematics, to make his parents proud, to build a career that would lift his family into the middle class. He had not sought adventure or danger. Yet history had placed him in a dormitory room with an enemy agent, and when confronted with that reality, he had chosen to act according to his values and his understanding of duty. The decision had cost him something, a piece of innocence perhaps, a straightforward relationship with trust and truth that could never be fully restored. But it had also revealed to him capabilities he had not known he possessed: observational acuity, courage under pressure, the ability to maintain composure while carrying tremendous stress. These qualities would serve him throughout his life, shaping a career and a character that, while never publicly celebrated, represented the best of what ordinary citizens could contribute when called upon by their country. The Cold War was fought not only by professional spies and military strategists, but also by hotel maids who noticed strange behavior, by clerks who reported suspicious activities, by students who paid attention when something seemed wrong. Michael Brennan was one of thousands of such individuals, most of whom remain unknown, whose small acts of vigilance and courage collectively contributed to the ultimate victory of democratic values over totalitarian ideologies. The broader significance of the Viktor Petrov case extended beyond the arrest of one Soviet intelligence officer. The intelligence gathered from his networks, particularly the one-time pad that Michael's photographs had revealed, allowed American cryptographers to decode months of intercepted communications. This breakthrough exposed additional Soviet agents operating under diplomatic cover, revealed recruitment strategies targeting American academics and researchers, and provided crucial insights into Soviet intelligence priorities during the early 1960s. The information influenced American counterintelligence strategies for years afterward, shaping how the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other agencies approached the penetration of universities and research facilities. The case also demonstrated the effectiveness of cooperation between ordinary citizens and law enforcement in protecting national security, a principle that remained relevant long after the Cold War ended. Michael Brennan's willingness to report his suspicions and then to assist actively in gathering evidence represented a model of civic engagement that intelligence professionals would cite in training materials for decades. The case showed that security was not solely the responsibility of government agencies, but a shared obligation that sometimes required courage and sacrifice from unexpected sources. For Viktor Petrov, the consequences of his exposure rippled through the remainder of his life. After his exchange to the Soviet Union in 1964, he was debriefed extensively by KGB counterintelligence officers who suspected he might have been compromised before his arrest and turned into an American double agent. Although no evidence supported this theory, the suspicion was enough to end his operational career. He spent the remaining decades of the Cold War working in administrative positions within the Soviet intelligence bureaucracy, pushing papers and training new officers, but never again trusted with field operations. His family suffered as well. His wife, whom he had married shortly before his American assignment, struggled with the stigma of being married to an officer whose mission had failed. Their children grew up under a subtle cloud of official disfavor that limited their career opportunities within the Soviet system. Viktor himself lived with the knowledge that he had failed his country and his service, a burden that was perhaps more difficult to bear than the 2 years he had spent in American federal prison. His letter to Michael Brennan in 1991 had been an attempt at closure, an acknowledgement that both men had been caught up in forces larger than themselves and had responded according to their respective loyalties. Whether Viktor ever found peace with his experiences remains unknown. He died in Moscow in 1997, his obituary in Russian newspapers, noting his service in foreign intelligence but providing no details about his arrest or exchange. His life stood as a reminder that espionage extracted costs from all participants, regardless of which side they served. The legacy of Michael Brennan's experience extends to contemporary discussions about security, privacy, and the balance between vigilance and paranoia. In an era where concerns about foreign intelligence operations remain relevant, though the specific adversaries have evolved, the principles Michael embodied remain instructive. He demonstrated that it was possible to be alert to genuine threats without succumbing to conspiratorial thinking, to report legitimate concerns through proper channels without becoming an informant who sees enemies everywhere, to assist law enforcement without abandoning basic human decency. His story reminds us that security in a democracy depends ultimately on the judgment and integrity of ordinary citizens who must navigate complex situations without clear guidance. The roommate who seems slightly off might indeed be a foreign agent, or might simply be an introverted student with unusual habits, determining which requires careful observation, measured assessment, and a willingness to act on reasonable suspicions while maintaining respect for the presumption of innocence. Michael's approach, characterized by documentation of specific anomalies rather than vague unease, by cooperation with authorities rather than vigilante action, represented a model that balanced legitimate security concerns with the values of an open society. His story offers no simple lessons, but rather illustrates the difficulty of these judgments and the courage required to act on them. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.